A voice on the radio, calm and routine, reporting a position like any other day, and then silence. The flight never arrived, and the search that followed found only open water. It is one of the strangest things that can happen in aviation. A machine the size of a building, slipping out of the sky and leaving the world with nothing to explain it. These are the stories of the aircraft that vanished, and the people who spent years trying to find them. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. The last words from the cockpit were ordinary, the kind spoken 1,000 times a night over every ocean on Earth. A controller in Kuala Lumpur told the flight to contact the next center in Ho Chi Minh City and wish the crew good night. The captain read the instruction back, calm and unhurried. Less than 2 minutes later, the aircraft vanished from radar, and it has never been seen again. What happened in the hours that followed became the strangest disappearance in the history of aviation. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was a red-eye from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, a routine 6-hour run across the South China Sea. The aircraft was a Boeing 777, one of the most reliable wide-body jets ever built, with 227 passengers and 12 crew aboard. Most of the passengers were Chinese, the rest a mix of 14 nationalities. In command was one of the airline's most experienced pilots, with more than 18,000 hours of flying behind him. At 20 past 1 in the morning, as the aircraft crossed a waypoint at the edge of Malaysian airspace, its transponder switched off. On the controller's screens, the target simply blinked out. For a long time, no one grasped what had happened. The Malaysian controller assumed the flight had passed out of range. The Vietnamese controllers waited for a call that never came. Hours slipped by in confusion, and the airline's own tracking system showed a phantom aircraft flying serenely toward Beijing while the real one was already gone. Only when the plane failed to land the next morning did a full search finally begin, in entirely the wrong part of the world. Then the picture grew stranger. Malaysian military radar had tracked an unidentified aircraft after the transponder died, and its path made no sense at all. The plane had turned hard back across the Malay Peninsula, skirted the border with Thailand, curved around the island of Penang, and headed up the Strait of Malacca before flying out of range. Someone had turned a Beijing-bound airliner around and flown it in the opposite direction, deliberately and with great skill, and had said nothing to anyone the entire time. The final clue came from space. A British satellite company realized that its spacecraft had exchanged a series of automatic signals with the aircraft, once an hour, for 7 hours after it disappeared. The plane had kept flying long after everyone assumed it had come down. By measuring these signals, engineers traced 2 vast arcs across the globe where the flight must have ended, one curving north into Central Asia, the other bending south into the emptiest quarter of the Indian Ocean. The northern path was ruled out, since the aircraft would have crossed military radar and been seen. That left the south, a stretch of ocean thousands of miles from any land, some of the deepest and least explored water on the planet. The last signal came at 19 minutes past 8 in the morning, the sound of an aircraft running out of fuel. The search that followed was the largest and most expensive in aviation history. Ships and aircraft from more than a dozen countries scoured the sea. First the surface, then tens of thousands of square miles of seabed with sonar dragged through canyons and mountains 4 kilometers down. They found 19th century shipwrecks and unmapped undersea terrain, but nothing of the aircraft. After years of searching, the effort was suspended, then privately revived, then suspended again. The plane was never located. What searchers did find washed up on distant shores. A wing panel came ashore on a French island east of Madagascar more than a year after the disappearance, its serial numbers matching the missing aircraft beyond doubt. Over the following months, an American drifter turned amateur investigator combed the beaches of Madagascar and Mozambique and found piece after piece. More than 30 fragments have been tied to the flight. Each one confirmed that the aircraft had come down in the Indian Ocean, and not one of them explained why. Investigators pieced together what the evidence would support. The turn back over Malaysia could only have been flown by hand, by someone who switched off the autopilot and pushed the jet near the edge of its limits in the thin air at high altitude. The communications gear had been shut down in a deliberate sequence. A phone aboard connected briefly to a tower near Penang, yet no one called for help. Whoever was flying knew the aircraft intimately and did not want to be found. The Malaysian report, when it finally came, laid out all of this and then declined to name a cause, unwilling to conclude what the evidence pointed toward. For the families, that silence was a cruelty of its own. Today, the aircraft rests somewhere on the floor of the Southern Ocean, its exact location unknown. The disappearance forced real change, and airliners built in recent years must now report their position automatically so that no large aircraft can ever again slip away unseen. But for the people who lost someone that night, no rule gives back the not knowing. They go to sleep still wondering where their loved ones are, with no wreckage to stand beside and no answer to hold. On a summer night in 1950, an airliner flying from New York to Seattle passed over Lake Michigan and never came out the other side. 58 people were aboard, families and children among them, on a routine crossing they had made without a thought. Somewhere above the black water, the aircraft came apart, and though pieces of it and pieces of the people washed ashore in the days that followed, the aircraft itself was never found. 75 years later, it is still down there, the only large commercial airliner in American history to vanish and never be recovered. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, a sturdy 4-engine propliner running Northwest Airlines' daily coast-to-coast service. It left New York in the evening with 55 passengers and 3 crew, bound first for Minneapolis. The captain was an experienced Northwest pilot who had flown the route for years, and he knew before takeoff that thunderstorms were building over the Great Lakes. As the flight pushed west into the night, a violent line of storms stood across its path, throwing lightning over the lake. Approaching Lake Michigan, the captain radioed for permission to descend, asking to come down to 2,500 feet, likely to get beneath the worst of the weather. Air traffic control did not immediately grant it because of other traffic in the area. That was the last anyone ever heard from the flight. Minutes later, along the shoreline, people reported the sputtering of engines somewhere out over the water and a flash of light in the storm. Then, nothing but the rain. When the flight failed to arrive, a search began across the lake. The Coast Guard and the Navy put vessels out onto the water, and what they found was heartbreaking and small. Cushions and clothing and shredded luggage drifted on the surface alongside a logbook from the aircraft and human remains, washed up along the beaches between Benton Harbor and South Haven. The fragments were tiny and torn, and they made the ending plain. The aircraft had struck the water with tremendous force and broken to pieces, and no one aboard could have survived it. The bodies were never recovered whole, and what remained was buried in 2 unmarked graves near the Michigan shore. Investigators worked the case for 7 months. They wanted to know whether the aircraft had exploded in the air or hit the lake intact, and the small size of the debris, together with the reports of a flash in the sky, kept the question open. The severe storm had surely played a part, but without the wreckage, there was no way to be sure of anything, and the Civil Aeronautics Board closed its report the way so few American crash reports end, admitting it did not have enough evidence to determine a cause. The aircraft that held the answer was somewhere on the bottom of the lake, and no one could find it. For most of a century, the crash was almost forgotten. It had the terrible luck to happen the day before the Korean War broke out, and the news moved on within 2 weeks. Then, decades later, a group of Great Lakes shipwreck researchers realized the flight had gone down near the waters they already searched, and they took up the hunt. Their work drew the attention of the adventure novelist Clive Cussler, a famous hunter of lost ships, who funded the effort and sent his own sonar team to comb the lakebed. Year after year, they went out, dragging side-scan sonar back and forth across the water as though mowing a lawn, chasing every promising target. Each one turned out to be a sunken ship, or scrap, or debris. The aircraft never appeared. The search went on for 20 years. In that time, the team covered some 700 square miles of lakebed, logged thousands of hours, and spent a small fortune, and still, the DC-4 stayed hidden. Scientists who study the lake's storms and currents were brought in to narrow the likely crash radius, and the searchers went over the most probable ground twice. In 2025, on the 75th anniversary, they finally stopped. The leader of the effort concluded that the aircraft had broken into pieces too small for sonar to see, and that over the decades, those pieces had sunk down into the soft muck at the bottom of the lake. Twice the same airline lost the same kind of aircraft over the same ocean, almost exactly 1 year apart, and both times the sea gave back nothing to explain it. There was no wreckage, no distress call, and no answer the investigators could prove. The 2 disappearances baffled the men who looked into them and seeded a legend that still hangs over that part of the Atlantic, the idea that something waits out there for aircraft crossing toward Bermuda. The airline was British South American Airways, formed after the Second World War by former RAF pilots to fly the long routes to the Caribbean and South America. It flew the Avro Tudor, a large 4-engine airliner built from the bones of a wartime bomber design, and the aircraft carried a troubled reputation from the start. The Bermuda run was one of the most demanding in the world at the time, a 2,000-mile leg from the Azores across open water to a cluster of islands barely 20 miles long. a speck in a vast ocean with no land for hundreds of miles in any direction. The Tudor flew it near the very limit of its fuel. The first aircraft was named Star Tiger. On the last day of January 1948, it set out from the Azores for Bermuda, with 31 people aboard. Strong headwinds stood against it that night, so the captain chose to fly low, down at 2,000 feet, trying to slip beneath the worst of the wind rather than fight it at altitude. It was a decision that would puzzle investigators later, because every position report the crew filed listed them at 20,000 feet, as though they had lost track of how low they actually were. In the small hours of the morning, the radio operator acknowledged a bearing from Bermuda, a routine fix on their position. That was the last anyone heard. When Bermuda called again a half hour later, only silence answered. The aircraft was close to its destination, in contact one moment and gone the next. The search turned up nothing, not so much as a life vest or a patch of oil across hundreds of hours of flying. The official inquiry worked through every possibility and rejected them one by one, and in the end it wrote one of the most remarkable admissions in the history of accident investigation. It said that no more baffling problem had ever been presented for investigation, that in the absence of any evidence the court could only suggest possibilities, none of which even rose to the level of probability. An airliner had vanished within reach of land, and the men whose job was to explain such things confessed that they could not. Then it happened again. Almost a year to the day later, in January 1949, another BSAA Tudor named Star Ariel left Bermuda for Jamaica. This time, the weather was perfect, calm and clear with no storm anywhere near the route. The captain climbed to 18,000 feet to take advantage of the fine conditions, and about an hour out, he radioed an ordinary message giving his position and his expected arrival. A few minutes later, he sent one more short transmission, saying he was changing radio frequency. That was all. The aircraft was flying through a clear sky in perfect visibility, and it never sent another word and never arrived. The response was enormous. Warships and aircraft poured into the search, including an American naval task force led by a battleship and 2 aircraft carriers, joined by dozens of vessels combing thousands of square miles of ocean southwest of Bermuda. For all that effort, the result was the same as before. Searchers found no trace of Star Ariel at all, nothing on the surface to show that an airliner had ever been there. A second Tudor had flown into clear weather and simply ceased to exist. 2 identical aircraft, lost from the same airline in the same waters a year apart, both gone without a clue. The coincidence was too much for the public to accept as ordinary bad luck, and the 2 Tudors became foundation stones of the Bermuda Triangle myth, cited again and again as proof that some unknown force haunted the Western Atlantic. The truth was almost certainly grimmer and more mundane. The Tudor was a troubled aircraft flown at the edge of its range, and suspicion later fell on its cabin heater, an unreliable unit mounted beneath the cockpit floor that could have started a fire or leaked fumes into the cabin without warning. A sudden failure like that, far out over the water at night, could bring an aircraft down before anyone had time to send a word. After Star Ariel, BSAA pulled its remaining Tudors from passenger service for good, and within a couple of years the airline itself was gone. No one has ever found either aircraft. They lie somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic, 2 airliners that took off within a year of each other and carried 51 people into the same silence. Whatever really happened on those 2 nights, the sea has kept it for more than 75 years, and the legend they created has long outlived the memory of the people who were actually lost. 24 American merchant seamen boarded the flight in Shanghai, going home. They had just delivered a tanker to China, a long job on the far side of the world, and now they were riding a chartered airliner back to New York with the whole trip behind them. The route ran up over the top of the Pacific and down through Alaska, an ordinary way home in those years. High in the mountains north of Anchorage, on a brilliant winter night, the aircraft flew into a peak and was swallowed by a glacier, and for more than 50 years it held its dead and its secrets deep in the ice. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4 flown by Northwest Airlines, chartered to carry the sailors and a crew of 6 from China all the way to LaGuardia. It had crossed the Pacific in stages and stopped at Anchorage to refuel, then lifted off into the dark for the next leg toward Canada. Ahead lay the Wrangell Mountains, a wall of high peaks, and among them stood Mount Sanford, a giant rising more than 16,000 feet. The published route curved safely around it, but the crew flew a straight line instead, cutting the corner between 2 peaks the way pilots often did in clear weather. That night, the sky was anything but ordinary. The aurora borealis was burning overhead with rare intensity, sheets of green light rippling across the whole northern sky. Investigators later came to believe it may have blinded the pilots, washing out the dark shape of the mountain ahead until it was too late to see. The aircraft was well off the airway, and a thin cap of cloud on the summit may have hidden it further. Flying at 11,000 feet, with its engines at full power, the DC-4 struck the side of Mount Sanford head-on. The wreckage slid 3,000 feet down the icy slope before it stopped. Everyone aboard was killed instantly. People in a town below saw the crash, and aircraft flew over the site within days. What they saw offered no hope. The wreckage lay scattered high on a glacier, broken and burned, in a place no rescue party could reach. Then the Alaskan winter closed over it. Snowstorm after snowstorm buried the debris. The glacier drew it inside itself, and within a short time there was nothing left on the surface to find. The bodies were never recovered. 30 men were simply gone into the mountain, and the crash faded into an old story about an airliner lost somewhere in the Wrangles. The story did not stay quiet because of the gold. The sailors had just delivered a tanker in China, and a rumor took hold that the aircraft had been carrying a fortune in gold or diamonds home from Shanghai. Over the decades, the legend of Alaska's lost treasure wreck drew hunters up the mountain again and again, and each of them was beaten back by the brutal altitude and the sheer remoteness of the place. None of them ever reached the aircraft, and no gold was ever found. The wreck stayed hidden, guarding a treasure that may never have existed at all. What finally solved it was not treasure hunting, but devotion. Two airline pilots, Kevin McGregor of Delta and Mark Millikan of Northwest, discovered by chance that each had been quietly researching the same lost flight, and they joined forces. On their own time and their own money, they made expedition after expedition to Mount Sanford, flying a small bush plane to the glacier and climbing out across the ice where every earlier search had failed. In 1997, they found the first pieces of wreckage. 2 years later, with permission from the families and the Park Service, they recovered enough to confirm at last that this was Northwest 4422. No gold was aboard. What they found instead mattered far more. Near the wreckage, preserved in the glacier, lay a human arm and hand, mummified by half a century in the ice. McGregor and Millikan turned it over to the authorities, and what followed became a landmark in forensic science. The fingerprints were there, but faint, and the tissue too degraded at first for the DNA methods of the day. It took 9 years and a team of scientists working with new techniques to bring the prints back and match them. In the end, they had a name. The arm belonged to a 36-year-old merchant mariner from Roanoke, Virginia, one of the sailors going home from China in 1948. It was the oldest identification of a person ever made from fingerprints, a name restored to one man more than half a century after he vanished into the mountain. He is the only one of the 30 who has ever been identified, and the only one brought home in any form. The other 29 remain where they came to rest, inside the glacier on Mount Sanford, carried downhill an inch at a time as the ice grinds slowly toward the valley. Someday it may give up more of them. For now, an airliner full of men who had finished their work and were nearly home lies frozen in an Alaskan mountain, found after 50 years by two strangers who refused to let it stay lost. The controllers in Makassar could see the aircraft drifting the wrong way across their screens, wandering north when it should have been tracking east. One of them said it aloud, half in disbelief, that the Atom Air flight was heading out over open water. Nobody yet understood that the two pilots had lost track of where they were, and that the machine meant to tell them was lying to one of them. Within the hour, the aircraft would be gone, and it would not be found for months. Flight 574 was a Boeing 737 crossing the Makassar Strait in eastern Indonesia, carrying 102 people on a New Year's Day run between two provincial cities. The aircraft belonged to Atom Air, a budget carrier that had grown at a reckless pace, adding jets faster than almost any airline in the country. This particular jet had a long history of trouble with its navigation system, the units that tell the crew the aircraft's position and attitude. For months, the two systems aboard had been disagreeing with each other, and maintenance had never found the root of it. Not long after takeoff, the fault returned. The two position displays began to diverge, and the autopilot, quietly following the faulty one, carried the aircraft off its assigned route. The pilots knew something was wrong but could not work out which system to trust. Instead of one man flying while the other solved the problem, both of them bent over the navigation units together, trading increasingly agitated remarks as the jet strayed deeper off course and into a towering wall of thunderstorms. Controllers tried more than once to steer them back, but no real correction ever came. For nearly half an hour, the two men worked the fault and let the aircraft fly itself. Eventually, they reached for the handbook and decided to reset the co-pilot system by switching it to a backup mode. What the crew did not grasp was that the switch would also disconnect the autopilot. When it disengaged, an alarm sounded, and someone reached over and silenced it without a word, their minds still fixed on the navigation units. No one was flying the aircraft now. This particular jet had another flaw. It pulled gently to the right, a small trim imbalance the autopilot had been silently correcting all along. With the autopilot gone and no hand on the controls, the aircraft began to roll, slowly at first, 1 degree every second. The captain made a couple of small inputs, but never seemed to understand that they were turning. The two men kept trying to reason out why the co-pilot's screens would not come back while the bank angle crept past 30 degrees. The captain, unsettled by what switching the system had done, told the co-pilot to put it back the way it was, still chasing the fault instead of flying. By now, the wings were banked so steeply they were shedding lift, and the nose began to drop. The aircraft rolled all the way over until it was upside down, then pitched nose down into a spiral dive. The captain finally understood how much trouble they were in and hauled back on the controls. But the aircraft was inverted, and pulling back only aimed it straight at the sea. The forces ripped the horizontal stabilizer clean off. The aircraft came apart, and at 9,000 feet, the recorders went silent. Back in Makassar, 10 minutes passed before controllers noticed the flight had dropped off radar. The search had almost nothing to work with, and no one even knew whether the aircraft had come down on land or at sea. Soldiers combed the jungle mountains of Sulawesi on foot while boats crossed the strait. After more than a week, fishermen began pulling pieces of the aircraft from the water, torn fragments of the tail and cabin scattered across the sea. An American ship soon picked up the pingers from the two recorders, lying on the seabed more than 2 kilometers down. Here, the real ordeal began. Recovering them from that depth would cost a fortune, and Atom Air flatly refused to pay, telling the government that if it wanted the boxes so badly, it could pay for them itself. For 7 months, the recorders sat on the ocean floor while families and investigators waited, fearing the cause would stay down there forever. Only when the airline agreed to cover half of a single week of searching did a salvage ship set out, and within 5 days, it lifted both boxes from the deep. No bodies were ever recovered, the impact so violent that little of the aircraft or the people aboard remained. When investigators read the recorders, they stopped looking for a broken part to blame. A navigation glitch had started it, but a glitch like that does not down an aircraft on its own. The pilots had never been trained to handle a failure like this, or to recover an aircraft rolled onto its back, and so they fixated on a minor fault until they flew a working jet into the sea. Behind them stood an airline that handed its crews manuals stamped not for use, whose mechanics fixed broken equipment by cleaning it and bolting it back in. The faulty navigation unit on this very jet had been written up more than 100 times in 3 months and never once repaired. The airline kept flying for another year, crash after crash, protected in part because one of its founders sat at the head of the country's parliament. The recorders had spent 6 months at the bottom of the sea, and the answer they finally gave was that this aircraft was lost long before it ever left the ground. The cargo jet lifted off from Tokyo on a winter night and made one routine radio call 20 minutes later, reporting its position over the Pacific. Nothing about it was unusual. It was bound for Los Angeles and then home to Brazil, carrying freight and a fortune in modern art, flown by one of the most respected captains in the country. When the crew missed their next scheduled call, controllers spent an hour trying to reach them. There was no reply, and there never would be. The aircraft and its 6 crew had disappeared into the ocean without a word, and neither they nor their strange cargo have ever been found. The aircraft was a Boeing 707 freighter belonging to Varig, the Brazilian flag carrier, returning from Tokyo by way of California. In its hold were 20 tons of cargo, and among the crates were 53 paintings by Manabu Mabe, a celebrated Japanese-Brazilian artist whose work had just been shown at an exhibition in Tokyo. The collection was worth well over $1 million, and it was heading back to Brazil after the show. A cargo jet vanishing with a fortune in art aboard was the kind of detail that would keep the mystery alive for decades. The man in command was no ordinary pilot. Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva had more than 23,000 hours in the air and was already a national hero in Brazil and France. 6 years earlier, he had been at the controls of another Varig Boeing when a fire broke out in a lavatory and filled the cabin with thick smoke on approach to Paris. Unable to see his instruments, he put the burning jet down in an onion field short of the airport, rather than risk crashing into the city. Most of the passengers had already died from the smoke, but he and a handful of others survived, and he was praised for keeping the disaster from being far worse. He had walked away from one catastrophe, now he had vanished in another. The flight took off from Tokyo in the evening and made its last contact about 20 minutes later, some 200 kilometers out over the water. The next report was due about 40 minutes after that and never came. When repeated calls went unanswered, The Brazilian and Japanese authorities launched a search, sending Navy and Air Force units to comb the ocean where the aircraft should have been. For 8 days, they searched the sea and found nothing at all. Not a single piece of wreckage or a trace of the 6 men aboard. The jet had simply stopped reporting and was never seen again. With no wreckage to study, investigators could only reason toward the most likely answer. The leading conclusion was a sudden loss of cabin pressure at altitude. If the fuselage had failed and the air rushed out, the crew could have lost consciousness within moments, too fast to send a distress call. The aircraft would then have flown on by itself under autopilot, straight and level, until its fuel ran out hours later and it fell into the empty Pacific, far from where anyone was looking. It was a plausible explanation for a silent disappearance, but it could never be confirmed because the aircraft that held the proof was somewhere on the ocean floor. The disappearance of Flight 967 closed the book on a remarkable aircraft in a grim way. The Boeing 707 flew for decades and was involved in hundreds of serious accidents over its career, and this is the only one whose cause was never determined. Everything about the flight simply stopped at once. The jet and the crew and the art all gone into the same stretch of dark water. Manabu Mabe would later repaint some of the works that were lost, but the originals never came home. Somewhere in the Pacific lie the remains of a jet, 6 Brazilian airmen, and 53 paintings that vanished on their way back from Tokyo, swallowed by the ocean, and never returned. Every story in this video started the same way. An aircraft was there one moment and gone the next, and each one ended somewhere different. Some of them came home. The glacier on Tupungato spent 50 years grinding stardust down its slope before it let the wreckage go, into the hands of 2 climbers who had no idea what they had found. A mountainside in Alaska held another aircraft for half a century before it surrendered an arm frozen in the ice, along with a name to go with it. Those endings came late, and they came in fragments, but they came. Somewhere a family finally had a place to point to on a map and say, that is where they were the whole time. The water keeps a different kind of silence. The airliner that went down in Lake Michigan was hunted for 75 years and never appeared because the pieces had sunk too deep into the mud to see. The freighter that vanished with a fortune in paintings lies somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, and no one has ever gone to bring it up. The soldiers bound for a war they never reached went into the sea west of Guam, and the only thing they left behind was a flash in the night sky that a tanker crew watched from a distance and could never explain. The largest search in the history of aviation swept tens of thousands of square miles of the Southern Ocean and came back with a single panel washed up on a beach on the far side of the world. The sea takes an aircraft whole and closes over it, and most of the time it gives nothing back. For the families, this is the hardest part. A crash leaves a place to go and a grave to visit, and these flights left them nothing of the kind. The people aboard did not so much perish as slip out of reach, held in a strange kind of absence that gives no ending to hold and no hope of return. You cannot bury someone the ocean still keeps, and mourning comes hard for a person who simply stopped in midair on a clear night and was never seen again. For many of these families, the grief never fully settles. They spend years waiting for a phone call that most of them never receive, unable to close a door that was never quite shut. What connects these flights runs deeper than how each one was lost. It is the people who refuse to stop looking. A tanker crew turned their ship around and combed the black water through the night. A handful of researchers gave 20 years and a small fortune to one patch of a single lake, dragging sonar back and forth as though mowing a field with no far edge. Wealthy explorers sent robots down into ocean canyons 4 kilometers deep. Families who were handed no graves spent decades asking only that the names of the missing be written down somewhere and remembered. Few of them ever got what they were after, and some got nothing at all. But the searching was its own kind of answer, a way of insisting that a person who vanishes is not the same as a person who was never there. There is something harder to name underneath it too. We do not like the idea that the modern world still has corners deep enough to swallow 100 people and keep them. We have mapped the planet from orbit and tracked every airliner across every sky, and we have taught ourselves to believe that nothing is truly beyond our reach. Then a jet the size of a building slips into the ocean without a trace, and the belief falls apart. Most of the time, the water and the ice remind us of exactly how much they still hold back. Somewhere out there tonight, the missing are still missing. A jet rests in the dark water off the Michigan shore with its story untold. 4 kilometers down in the Indian Ocean, another sits with its answers sealed inside it. 6 airmen and a cargo of paintings lie somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, and a night sky over Guam holds the only clue anyone ever had. And high in the Andes, a glacier is moving an inch at a time, carrying what remains of stardust slowly downhill toward the day it comes out into the light. The ice and the sea keep their own clocks. Some of what they hold, they hand back to us in time. The rest waits for us to build better tools, or waits for no one at all. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.